everybody, welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. So today we are talking about another story out of Ray Bradbury's Dark Carnival. We are up to The Jar now. And The Jar is a very successful story by Ray Bradbury. It was first published in the November issue of Weird Tales from 1944. And it has been republished many times in several different collections. Of course, it's in October Country. I looked at the version in October Country, and once again, the differences are very subtle. It really is an excellent story, and I really enjoyed reading it. The first thing I noticed is, for some reason in this story, the comparisons that he makes all throughout the story began to stick out for me. I think that this might have been a time in his writing career when he was really experimenting with the idea of comparing one thing to another thing. He talks about people's voices and he compares them to frog voices. Once he has the jar, he puts it up on a shelf and he compares the house that he lives in now to a palace, and the jar is on the throne of the palace. He compares his wife's hips to a pendulum of a clock, and he senses the passing of time by his wife's hips swaying as a pendulum. Of course, I'm going to say the same thing that I always say about this, which is it's incredible, it's excellent, you absolutely should pick it up. The Jar's a great story. We're going to talk about it more in detail, but of course I highly recommend it. I would pick it up. It's a story of a man who buys a specimen jar from a carnival, and he takes it home to show off to his friends because the town doesn't respect him, and he feels like the jar will give him respect. All right, so I'm going to go into some spoilers now. So if you haven't read The Jar yet, definitely pick this up and definitely read it. So there's a carnival outside of a small town in Louisiana, I believe. There's a gentleman there who's staring at this specimen in a jar. He paid a dime. He went into the tent and he's staring at this specimen. This takes place in the 40s. And the carnival is closing down for the day. And the owner of the carnival comes in and sees the man staring at the jar and decides that this would probably be a good time to try to sell off the specimen jar. So they go back and forth a little bit, and the gentleman decides that he would like to buy the specimen jar for $12. And the owner of the carnival says a strange thing, that he's actually happy to be getting rid of it, because when he looks at it, he gets these strange thoughts, but then he just stops and he takes the money and he sells the jar. So now our lead character has the jar. He puts it on his horse-drawn carriage, and he goes riding back to the small town that he's from. And when he pulls into town, all the men have gathered outside, I think the dime store basically. They're just all hanging out, talking politics and, just passing time, I guess. And as he pulls up, they're pretty disrespectful towards him. It's pretty clear that he doesn't have a great reputation in town. But he shows everybody the jar, and they're all instantly really interested at what's in the jar and what it could possibly be. And he quickly puts it back down and he says, "You guys can come up to my place anytime you want, and you can look at this jar." And he goes riding away. One of the people in the crowd, who must be, I guess, really angry with our lead character, yells out that his wife will never let him have that in their house. But it's too late. He's already ridden away on his wagon, so he doesn't hear any of that. So when he gets home, he puts the jar up on a shelf, and his wife comes in, and she sees it. She stands there for a minute, just staring at the jar, and then she says, "It looks just like you," and she runs out of the room. And this is our first indication that people who see the jar might see different things. Because when he looks at the jar, he sees this weird, just gray, floating object. It kind of maybe looks a little bit like a brain. It's got eyes and it's staring out. They're just gray, though. They don't see anything. The description of it is really very amazing. Obviously, I can't do this story any justice compared to what Ray Bradbury did. Reading it is the best way to get the sense of this story. But she sees him in the jar. She feels like the object in the jar looks just like him, and it freaks her out. Then some of the men show up to his place, and they come in and they all look at the jar. And over time, this kind of becomes a ritual. I believe it happens like maybe once every few days. A large group of people show up at the house, and they come in and they all sit down and they just stare at the jar. And it really makes the lead in this story feel great. Suddenly he feels respected and he feels like he has friends. All the men sit on the floor and stare up at the jar, and all the women kind of clump together in the back and just talk about it. But as time goes by, they start developing this kind of ritual. They kind of say the same things over and over again as they stare at the jar. An old man will perk up about, it looks like a brain, or it's got this color hair or this color eyes, which are different than what our lead character sees. There's a woman who insists that it looks just like her child who passed away when he was 3, that he ran off into the swamp and vanished, but now she sees him in the jar, and all the other women try to make her understand that it's not her child that's in the jar, because they all see different things. But apparently they have this same conversation over and over again every time they all come to the house. And Ray Bradbury explains it beautifully, that looking at the jar, you feel the need to say the same thing, but because you're looking at the jar, it doesn't sound like you're saying the same thing. It's this very interesting, weird thing that the jar does. And it is slightly menacing, but that's really only based on what the carnival owner was saying. The people at the house aren't feeling like it's evil or deadly, you know? The carnival owner, I think, did feel that way. And the owner of the jar certainly does not feel that way. He's actually really proud to have it and to be able to share it with his friends. So the wife gets more and more angry about the jar being there and about the joy that it's giving her husband. And the bully from the town also shows up every once in a while, but he doesn't come in the house. He just stands out on the porch. And it's interesting the way Ray Bradbury describes him. He says that this person always has a shadow over their face, always. You cannot see his face. All you can see is his glowing eyes shining out from the shadow that he's in. So when he stands out on the porch instead of coming in the house, his face is completely shadowed, but his eyes are piercing through the shadow, and his eyes are constantly laughing at you, which is how the lead character in the story feels. He feels like this person is constantly mocking him. So this person shows up to the house, and then he leaves, and our lead character's wife goes with him. They leave together. And then after a long while, everybody who was sitting there staring at the jar eventually leaves. And he goes to bed, the owner of the jar. And then at like midnight, his wife finally comes back. And she crawls into bed and she says, "I want you to guess where I've been." And he says, "I don't know." And she explains that she went with the bully of the town, and they drove out and found the carnival that our lead character bought the jar from. And they talked to the owner of the carnival, and they found out that he bought it for $12. And they asked him what was in the jar, and he explained that it was fake, that it was just a metal skeleton with paper mache and clay, and that our lead character had been completely swindled. And she further explains that she's going to tell everybody in the town that it's fake, that she wants to ruin this joy that he has found. And he gets very angry with her. And there was a person earlier in the story who told a very sad story about how when they were a child, they had a cat who kept having kittens. And it got to the point that the child's parents didn't feel like they could take care of all of these kittens. And they'd already given a bunch away. and they just didn't know what to do with the kittens. So what they decided to do was they filled up a big old glass jar with water, and they ordered this kid to drown the kittens. So he had to pick up each of these kittens. Their eyes were still closed. They were literally just born. He had to pick them up and drop them in the jar and watch them drown. And then pick up another one and drop it in the jar and watch it drown. And he said that he didn't feel like the dead kittens were accusing him of doing a terrible thing, that they just kind of floated there, not accusingly, but that they also didn't like him. And that's probably what that person was seeing in the jar when they stared at the jar, of course. So he gets very angry with his wife, and he starts saying, "Here, kitty, kitty, here, kitty, kitty." And then we cut to the next day. A lot of people have showed up. They're all sitting at the floor. They're staring at the jar. And the old man is saying, "Didn't it used to have gray hair, but now it has brown hair?" And another person is saying, no, it always had brown hair. And he's saying, "Didn't it used to have gray eyes, but now it has brown eyes?" And another person is saying, no, it always had brown eyes. And the bully is standing out on the porch, but the bully is not smiling anymore at all. And his eyes are not laughing anymore. Ray Bradbury describes him as kind of gaunt, and his mouth is just hanging open. It looks like he's been kicked in the face. And you get the idea that it seems like this guy maybe killed his wife, put her in the jar, which doesn't make sense, right? He must have maybe cut off her head and put her head in the jar. And maybe he went and told the bully about it and scared the bully so bad that now the bully doesn't dare to say anything about it. Or maybe the bully's just scared because he recognizes her in the jar. I don't know. It just kind of ends there. It's a very strange, scary, bizarre ending. It is a really good story. It's a really strange story. I love the way that Ray Bradbury wrote it. You absolutely have to read it. All those comparisons that I was talking about work so well. And it's crazy because he's not doing it to build nostalgia, which I found was very interesting. That's one of the things I really love about reading these early stories. I think that Ray Bradbury later in his life realized the power of nostalgia and the good old days, right? So he uses that as a tool really, really well in order to get readers intrigued by his stories. But this early stuff doesn't really have that. It's kind of modern day at that time. It's kind of 40s life. So that's kind of neat to see from Ray Bradbury as opposed to the nostalgia that we're so used to. So a couple things that I found kind of strange about the story. Number one, of course, is the wife. The wife is the bad guy in the story, and the husband is a victim. And that's a very strange way to set this story up, especially if he kills his wife, you know. And I do understand that in the past, divorce was thought of as this really horrible thing that you just could not do. And I think it made a lot of people feel really trapped. And honestly, I'm really thankful to be in a time where that is not the case. If you are truly, truly unhappy in the situation you're in, you can change your situation. You know, I personally haven't had to go through that, and I'm very thankful for that, of course. But I'm also really, really happy that we live in a world where it's perfectly acceptable. You know, I think that humans have a tendency to kind of create their own hell if they're not careful. You can build a world that you live in that you hate, but you don't have to stay there. And that's a very, very good thing. And I feel like the characters in this story are really trapped in their world. And it's kind of written in a way that his only solution was to kill his wife, which is just horrible, right? That is not the solution, ever the solution. So I found that kind of interesting, and I know I've read some criticisms that this type of a wife character may come up rather often in his stories. We'll see as we continue to read, of course. So that was one thing about it. Another thing about it is it was very kind of predictable. It was very straightforward. A guy sees this evil thing, he gets obsessed by it, he buys it, and he takes it home, and it takes over his life. You know, it's just a very basic, straightforward story. Now, of course, back in 44, that probably wasn't the case, obviously, right? I think at the time it was very kind of shocking and surreal and bizarre, but for today it was a little bit predictable. Speaking of that, there are several productions of this on television. It was originally produced for the Alfred Hitchcock Hour back in the early 60s. The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, of course, is just Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but they changed the name of it, I think from 62 to 65, and it was in that portion of the show that The Jar was done. And that received a lot of praise. People really enjoyed that. Then it was redone in the 80s when they brought the Alfred Hitchcock Hour back, and that version was directed by Tim Burton, and I don't think that did well. And then they redid it again for Ray Bradbury Theater. And that version did okay, I think. So if you're looking to watch this, I would definitely recommend the 60s version from the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please hit the like button. If you like this kind of content, please hit subscribe. And you can hit the bell so you know when we have new videos coming out. And have a great day.